So we've come to, I think, an exciting time. The closing keynote will make an attempt to sort of bring things together a little bit. I'm not going to tell you about Narinder. You can read about him in the program. What I will say is that we met, I don't know, God, it was probably 4 years ago, I think. We're both based in New York, and he came in and what I remember, I remember some of the things we talked about, but I remember this being this kind of whirlwind of energy between the two of us, bouncing off the walls and lightning flying all over the place. And I know I felt afterwards more energized and more excited about some of the things we'd been talking about. So I thought he'd be a good person to help bring this the summit together a little bit and see if we can sort of tie some of the themes. So, Narinder Singh.
Thank you so much for having me. So good news, bad news. No matter how good or bad this is, you'll be done in 45 minutes. I want to thank you guys for having me here. I wanted to start today with, usually I try to tell a funny story about my wife and I. My wife's a development economist, and she's way smarter than me in a lot of the issues that you face, and I usually try to tell a story around that. But today I wanted to start a little bit differently. I'm on the board of a nonprofit. I work with a lot of smaller nonprofits in fundraising. And a lot of times, this is the quote that I bring up when I'm fundraising for a nonprofit that I'm involved in. And I bring it up because usually I'm sitting there in front of potential donors, and I'm a board member, and I feel like I'm just like them, where I look at a change that I want to have in the world, but I am also recognizing that I myself am not putting my career and my livelihood towards that change. And I look at an organization I'm supporting and say, how can you, as a potential donor, not want to do more? Voltaire's quote sets a bar for us that can never quite be reached, and I feel that humility when I'm supporting organizations that I care about, and I feel that same sense here today as I sit in front of a room or stand in front of a room that's dedicated, a lot of the people in here, their lives to making someone else's life better. So as I go through the rest of my day and talk about some of the things you could be doing and you should be doing, recognize that it comes from a place of great admiration for folks that have taken that step to actually make a commitment to make the world a better place, so thank you for that. So I wanted to start a little bit about myself, not because it's necessarily that relevant to what I'll talk about, but it gives you some context. So I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. I know that was what you were going to guess. Grew up in the Midwest, a product of that. I'm a huge Bengals fan, which actually pays root this year, but in general, not so much. But I come from that kind of middle of nowhere beginning, and my parents immigrated to the country, loaf of bread and a few $100s in their hand, and kind of lived the American dream. I went to school, I joined Accenture, Anderson Consulting, moved out to the Valley to a .com. It grew like crazy and then ungrew like crazy. And I joined SAP in corporate strategy, trying to find a little bit of stability in the world and make sense of it all. And it was when I was in SAP in corporate strategy that really kind of my journey of technology and philanthropy collided for the first time. After 9/11, I had been involved in starting a nonprofit called the Sikh Coalition around kind of a lot of the hate crimes and bias attacks that were happening in the US towards people of the Sikh faith. And it had started to grow. So I was working at SAP in corporate strategy, and we needed a donor management system. And, you know, back then, this is 2004, 5-ish, there weren't a lot of options. We were kind of on spreadsheets. And I saw this thing from Salesforce.com for 10 free licenses. And so I'm like, well, I should check this out. And lo and behold, in a couple days, I put together a donor management system. And I was thinking that SAP, it used to take me a day or two to do my expense reports. I would literally do them once a quarter because I needed to memorize all the German codes for figuring out how to navigate screen to screen. And I was like, the world is changing if I can put in a system in the time I can take to enter a piece of information in one. And it really started to make me think about what I was doing and how the world was coming together. And I helped start a company called Aperia a little bit after that, was focused on helping organizations adopt cloud computing and emerging technology. And that organization today is about 1,200 people. I'm still on the board of that organization. And I owe it all, in fact, in many ways, to my philanthropic interest. So I've always kind of seen this tie between them. And so I took the first half of this year off, and I worked with a bunch of startup NGOs, one that was doing tablet-based education in rural India, a civil rights nonprofit, community health workers group in East Harlem, where a woman who started it based on work she had done in Africa and India and was bringing that model back to the US. So I got to work with a lot of startup NGOs. In my career at Aperia, I've gotten a chance to work with a lot of large organizations, and I'd gotten a chance to work with commercial organizations who were looking to bring innovation to them. So today I wanted to take a little bit of those angles and bring them together into what I thought was some of the pendulum of change and how it would affect organizations like you. So to start with, I'll bring up a quote we've seen some focus of in a couple different sessions here today. My favorite version of it, since 2000, more than half the Fortune 500 have dropped off the list. Pretty dramatic number. We've heard this in a couple different things, but just 15 short years. And the way I always visualize this is in my lifetime, I saw a Blockbuster Video get built in my neighborhood in Cincinnati, Ohio, and then get torn down as Netflix came across or repurposed. So in my lifetime, we've seen the rise and fall of companies because of the digital age. It's been an incredible experience to look through that. And if you think about what some of that's been caused by, one is obviously the growth of cloud computing. I mentioned my story, in fact, around that, but you can see today, if I think about companies that are leading the revolution in cloud, like Salesforce, Workday, Amazon, those companies didn't exist in the year 2000. So dramatic change in the tech industry, for sure, from companies because of a new paradigm. But it's not just the tech industry, of course. We're seeing that influence all aspects of business now. So this is one of my favorite quotes from GE. GE, in their IT and R&D budget, spends more than the revenue of the bottom of the Fortune 500. So their expense line in IT and R&D is a Fortune 500 company, right? So to think about they're looking at cloud as transforming their business, it gives you some context for how big a disruption this is. Of course, the second disruption around here is mobile, and we've talked about this lots of different ways throughout the week. The couple things that I like about this slide shows how long did it take to get to 100 million, 200 million, a billion users. And you see the last generation of video games and early phones to the Android and iOS and Facebook and WhatsApp, 600 million a few months ago. Now it's projected to be a billion by January. Interesting fact about WhatsApp is with about 40 engineers, they do more SMS messages than every telco in the world combined. All right, so you start thinking about what's the profound notion of what leverage means in this new world. And so cloud and mobile, though, we've heard about before. This is not new in terms of concept, but it's just the beginning of a trend of technology that we're seeing again and again. And with mobile, it's not just adoption, it's driving revenue. So this is showing Facebook's revenue growth, and you can see it's almost all come from mobile. Right? So this is after Facebook became a big deal. They still saw mobile as the way of monetizing that. So cloud and mobile are a big deal. Great. Thank you, Narinder, for that insight that we had no idea was happening. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the technologies. We've talked a little bit earlier this week about cars. I think there was a bunch on automated cars, and Google's obviously been a pioneer for this. And really, the gentleman from Microsoft took my joke, which is a friend of mine said, my son is 2 years old, and he'll probably never get a driver's license, right? And I think he changed it to say he won't be allowed to get a driver's license. But if you see what Google has done, they've bought about 10 robotics and AI companies over the past few years, and the self-driving car is just one mechanism of that. You've seen that result in every car has got different systems around some semi-automated driving, and of course it's everywhere now. But the real concept here is not the automated car, but it's what allows it to be an automated self-driving car. It's the machine learning and deep learning around that. And it's not just cars. For those of you who can't cook like me, you can rely on Watson to help you with cooking. This is a collaboration food truck between Watson and the New York Culinary Institute on new food recipes. And I think they had a tamarind barbecue, Swahili sauce was their new invention. But it was basically looking at the chemical contributions of flavor and combining them in the ways that chefs hadn't thought about. And it's a great example of where man and machine met together. So AI combining flavors with new things and using the chef's judgment to actually curtail that in another direction. Similarly, if you look at medical care, the amount of medical information will go 200x by 2020 and doubling every couple of years after that. You will be able to take your entire genomic sequence on a memory stick to your doctor and say, help me, right? And obviously the tools that we have today, there's no way for a doctor who cares for 1, 2, 3,000 patients in a year is going to be able to use that information without having some kind of assistance. And you start thinking about the profound implications of these things, not just on the industries that I'm showing, but the derivative aspects. What's the impact of Google on the insurance industry, on the self-driving car and the insurance industry? What's the impact of that on what you do with your time between home and away? Is home in your office is a time for an extended office? Is it an entertainment center? What is it? You can see the derivative impacts of these industries as much as what's happening in them, and it's only going to increase. Similarly, we start seeing what's happening with wearables. It started with Google Glass, perhaps an experiment, Apple Watch, even celebrities like will.i.am claimed they were going to make wearables. In fact, Forrester said, you know what, this is getting a little ridiculous. Are we going to be the bionic men and women? Is this what we're going to look like? And I think this is another path of emerging technology. This road is not always smooth. You will see dramatic breaks in it that start to say, well, this doesn't make sense. It's not going to work the way we thought it was going to. And then you see a reemergence of innovation, where you see people saying, well, wearables don't have to be what we imagined initially. In fact, wearables can be something that are just going through and part of the human body. There's actually now, it's not just one company, there's about a dozen different companies that make some form of a patch that will track pulse, EKG, and many other pieces with low power or virtually no power at their disposal. So again, seeing dramatic changes in what we're looking at. I think there's 110 million devices connected today, roughly, and they're looking at that number as doubling every 2 to 4 years. So pretty profound changes that we'll start to see there. This next slide, we're going to play a guessing game. Audience participation, because I know everybody's getting a little tired here. Okay, so shout out as soon as you know what this tech is. You shout out what the tech is, not that I know. Yes, I think I don't have a prize for you, but congratulations. Okay, all right, you already got one prize. So 3D printing, and it's actually interesting that I was talking this earlier today with Carol about how some folks were asking, how can this be one of these 9 big pillars on this map that they went together? 3D printing is probably amongst the most distributed sets of technology that we're seeing here. There's an all 3D printed band you can have. You can say, I want this guitar configured to the room dynamics that I'm going to be playing in. 7 of the 10 fastest times at the NFL Combine, that's American football, were done using 3D printed shoes, Nike Vapor. So you can imagine that's going to be pretty dramatic, but we're going to see some really profound shifts. Obviously, there's a huge debate already because in the United States, we're fascinated with guns, and now we're fascinated with how 3D printing might actually change that. You can print a 3D printed gun, downloading the parts off the designs off the internet and printing the parts. Pretty scary sets of things of what can happen with technology, but similarly, you start to see, the kid in the middle. There was a nonprofit, I think this one's from New Zealand, where they basically made him a prosthetic extension of his hand for about $100 for something that used to cost $10,000, right? And then, of course, you start seeing it's actually a way of expressing and bringing not just function back to people through prosthetics, but also fashion, letting them actually express themselves not as a disability, but of an extension of who they are. In fact, if you have a knee replacement or hip replacement in the UK, chances are it will be 3D printed. We're a little behind that in the US. So again, dramatic senses of things of where there's risk and reward around technology. And my purpose here is not, we could actually go on. We could talk about genomics and lots of different disruptive functions in technology. But what I wanted to do is set a little bit of a stage for this. If you look at this, with these kinds of disruptions, we're going to continue to see industries being destroyed and recreated. No doubt about it. This is going to, the trend we saw in the last set of years, we're going to see this to continue. And for for-profits, we're going to see navigating this as their primary challenge over the next decade and a half. The question is, are you different? Right? What is this going to mean for your industry? How is this going to change what that looks like? And if you start thinking about your own situation, you start looking at things that used to be considered advantages. Like when you talk about scale, millennials see an efficiency, right? When you talk about a long legacy, some will say it's going to be difficult for them to evolve. When you talk about having a proven record, they're going to say, well, that's a lack of experimentation of looking at different ways of solving the same problems. When you say mission-driven, this still means the same thing. You're resource-constrained, right? That one doesn't change so much. But it's an interesting set of things where you actually get punished for being mission-driven, but you get punished for having a legacy, and you all of a sudden are dealing with change at a rapid rate without enough necessarily all the degrees of freedom that you'd want to change it. So let's kind of compare and contrast. David had some numbers before, and I thought I would show kind of the pendulum of how your spending on IT relates to maybe an emerging for-profit. So for example, Aperio, we started in 2006. So we had a pretty significant set of advantages in that we were the first generation of company that could be built in the cloud, right? And so we were a series of information workers, about 1,200 people today. And if you look at our IT spending today, it's about 2.4%. So we are half the Gartner benchmark for our industry in size, right? And we are, latest and greatest technology for our employees. But the fact is almost all that savings is in labor and the power of the cloud computing platforms that we use, so we don't have to actually go through the same things that we have. And if you look at that range, you would say our variance in percentage that we spend through our history probably looks something like this. This is illustrated. So, roughly around that, maybe we had a big implementation. We went something, we were up and out, but we were around that 2.4% almost steadily throughout because all of our cost was OpEx, right? We scaled smoothly. If you look at your numbers in nonprofits, I would guess it looks something more like this, right? And this is an interesting experience that I've had working with startups in the NGO space where it's clear they need operational investment, but what happens? They're driven by a passionate founder. All the resources are pushed into the work, and it's amazing when you get there and you're like, they're cobbling this together with spreadsheets at best and some resources, and they grow and grow and grow, and then finally what happens is they're like, all right, we're about to break. And then there's a huge investment necessary to actually kind of get caught up, right? And then sometimes you see a little bit of confusion over what to do next because you just kind of flexed up to build this capacity. Now what do you do with it, and how does it kind of smooth back into the organizational hold? Let me use an example to illustrate what this spread looks like as you kind of grow. So this is taken off some numbers that we've had and some kind of estimates. So I won't claim that they're spreadsheet level detailed, but you'll get the idea. Think about an initiative you had. Any big initiative where you have a project-based kind of thing, you're going to have a bunch of effort, you're going to have a unit cost, and you have a total cost. Well, on average, our estimates are that your unit cost is about 20 to 40% less than you would have in a for-profit environment. Your cost of labor internally, not even counting your cost of software, your cost of consulting rates, it's about 20 to 40% less than what we would see in a commercial setting. But if you look at the project sizes, in absolute dollars, if I varied it based on just your employee size, what would I expect if you were a for-profit? We've seen these being roughly 20 to 40% more. And so that means that the overall effort to actually get a big thing up is about 1.5 to 2 times. And so we were batting this about a little bit with some colleagues, and there's a couple reasons for this. The first is I do believe, as a whole, your sector is more complicated than the employee counts would show, right? Because you're more distributed, you're working in a more range of geographies, so it's a little bit more complicated than the employee-to-employee comparison would be. And the second part is this dramatic delay of investment. Non-smooth investment curves lead to this big pendulum, and you end up in this big kind of situation. All right, so now what? So what? What does that mean? Well, here's what it looks like. This is my, this is what you look like early in your career, where you get sand kicked in your face, according to the commercial. Then you kind of build up to do these 1.5 to 2x projects. You hire a bunch of consultants, you build up staff, and then the struggle is actually to get to that right lean in between. Because you still need technology, but you don't need it to be set in the same way that you have historically. And it's very difficult, and it's why a lot of you use consultants so much, is because it's hard to cut people once they join, right? It's a difficult cultural thing, especially in mission-driven organizations, so you tend to lean on consultants a lot. But it really creates a complexity, and it causes a hard time in answering the question, what kind of technology should you be investing in? Because frankly, the kinds of technology that lead to this is not the kind of technology you want to be lean and mean in later, right? You don't want to be a back office creating machine over time. And we'll talk a little bit about how that manifests itself. But first, for a second, a quote. We need to reinvent IT. We needed to lead by consumerizing our approach to technology to drive the next generation of our business. Any guesses as to who said this? That's because absolutely everyone says this, right? Every person has gotten in front of a room and said, this is what we're going to do, right? It's this kind of rallying cry. But what does that actually mean? How does this actually work? Well, here's some actual numbers, right? So this is a Forrester-Gartner blend. You guys have seen, and we referred to this kind of run, build, transform notion, 60, 30, 10. Depending on where you get the numbers, it'll range. By industry, it'll range. And if you look at kind of progressive CIOs, and this is based on a survey that we did across for-profit and nonprofit, mostly for-profit CIOs, so about 300 CIOs at Aperio. We got numbers that look like this. This is what their kind of future state would look like. But acknowledging that this is actually what newcomers in their space do, right? So I think a lot of what we look at, it's not going to be about pushing that percentage number up or down. That actually matters much less than what's the composite of how that looks. And the difference between transformative leaders and everybody else is how fast you can move to the right point in that graph, from the left side to something in between the other two. Because if we're spending technology dollars on things that are a commodity that can be provided in lots of other places, we're never going to get there. So the key thing is, how do you go about making this transition quickly? So we want to go through a couple things here. 4 key concepts to drive this transformation, and I'm going to cover the first 2 today. We can talk about some of the others another time, but in the interest of time and hopefully having a dialogue around this, we're going to focus on the first 2 things, which is be more than you can see and creating and accessing compelling platforms. This is really kind of the external piece of what you would look at. The last 2, future-proofing your people, managing risk, are really internal drivers that you need to be able to deal with in order to get the most out of that. So the first part of this, anybody know what this stands for? WIZADI. What you see is all there is, that's right. And Peter Coffey sitting in the audience there, I think, got that one. Peter, for extra credit, do you know where this is from? I do not. It's from, there's a Nobel Prize winning economist, Daniel Kahneman, who wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's not a book about business, but it's my favorite business book I've read the last 5 years. It really talks about bias and how we think about things. Right? And so we have one of the big biases he talks about is that we have a propensity to fill the room with our assumptions. So if I said Julie is courageous, smart, you already are making an opinion on who that person is. And if the next 2 words were divisive and, inconsistent, you would almost ignore those because if you've already made that snap judgment. We really focus on everything we have around that, and there's this consistent set of bias around just being about what we know. And so it's really a difficult thing of saying, how do you move beyond that? Well, there's one thing that, it's actually very difficult to systematically remove that bias from you. So the one thing you can do is fill your world of all there is more directly. How do you actually have a bigger view of the world that you're in order to actually not have that bias apply to you? And so in technology, here's a couple things that we go through. We used to always say, know the business, and this is supposed to strike through. But I think it's not know the business, you have to know your customer, right? And in your case, the customer is the people that you're trying to actually help, right? And this is really directed to the folks that in the IT organization. I'll talk a little bit about kind of the caveats for this for the business side, but instead of saying know the business, know the customer. Really understand the service you're trying to deliver out to the person you're trying to help, right? Because that knowledge holds over time. Knowing your business and the dynamics and how it's changing, that's actually asking a lot of somebody coming into your organization. But asking them to understand the service you provide at a really deep level is really important. Second thing is be more technical. This is actually vaguely, it's cool again to learn to code. Mayor Bloomberg said he was going to learn to code last year. It's becoming more interesting. But I think it is really important to talk about, we actually, as technology professionals, are so busy trying to disguise ourselves and say, no, we can be strategic and understand the business. But guess what? The business needs to be technical. It needs to understand how technology is going to drive this change, and it's your responsibility in this room to bring that knowledge to the business. Because if you're not doing it, you're going to have a huge gap in the organization. The second thing I would say is, because I know there's a few folks who are from the program side, is that this actually applies pretty much to the program side as well. I think one of these false things is that we need to bring the business and technology people together so we can have a conversation. No, we need the technology people to know the customer, and we need the business people to be more technical. Then we can actually have a conversation to really create in a different way. If we try to map 2 people together, that's always going to result in a gap in understanding. But when we have someone who understands the other side of what the world looks like more deeply, you have an opportunity to communicate, right? And so that's a really important part of how you start to look at those mappings to be together. Run a mile as your coworker. This is my substitution for know the business. What I always ask in organizations, especially more senior levels of IT, is whose job could you do if you weren't in IT? Is somebody in accounting, a program officer? Who is it? Whose job do you know well enough to say, I could go do? That, to me, is the testament of somebody in your technology team really being able to step up. Like, where is it that you have as much knowledge as the business or the program or whatever it is about your organization? And I think that, to me, is a clear sign. And on one hand, I'm always careful when I talk about measurement to nonprofits, which I'll mention in a second. But measure what you care about and act to improve it. And this is referring really more to IT and technology leaders in the organization. What do you actually care about? Is it an objective to say, hey, how many of my people on my staff actually could do a job in the organization? How many folks have actually visited and understand the service we provide to customers, our end clients in detail? Finding a way of measuring it. I will say in this audience, and I wrote this down after David's presentation from the first day, I think you need to measure more, but you need to do it less often. And I think this is a real danger, actually, because it's tough, because in for-profits, net income, we're done, right? You guys have a whole host of measurement challenges externally. And sometimes what happens is, because it's not clear how to measure that external piece, it becomes opening up every layer of what's happening internally at a degree of scrutiny that we generally don't have out in other industries. And I think it's really important because it's very difficult to have lots of measurements. So on one hand, when I see 17 goal areas from the UN, I'm like, how many can you name, right? Then again, I think when I was at SAP, we had 33 top-level corporate goals, and that was for a company. This is for the world. Maybe it's actually, on balance, okay. But the point being, less is always better, and you've got to proxy that, because I really feel like you need to be deeper and more measured, more analytical, but you can't do that across every dimension in the organization. And so really finding that balance is important in order to kind of figure out how to move as an IT leader from that run, build, transform of today to the future. The second thing I want to talk about is platforms. And I kind of gave away my slide here. Does anybody recognize these little bubbles? I heard somebody mumble it. Yes, very good. Your business school professor would be very proud of you. And so it's funny, Michael Porter, this literally taught in every business school MBA class for probably the last 25 years. And it's ironic to me is that there's no platforms in here. Like, it's kind of a past paradigm if you think about it. This was kind of, and obviously competition and the industrial structure, I think, works for your industry, not necessarily the competitive aspect to the same extent. But this missing aspect of platforms is really important. It's become the central driving force of business strategy in the last decade and a half. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but what I want to cover is really talk about how to think about creating and accessing compelling platforms, how to stand on the shoulders of giants, and then looking at that in the lens of your solution, technology, and talent. So we'll walk through those different things. So first I want to start with something that's going to look like it doesn't make sense for you guys, and hopefully it'll bring back a little bit. So when I talk to for-profits, a lot of times I tell you, hey, what is developer.yourcompany.com? What's your interface to the outside world to get them to engage on your platform in order to change, to create change? And so obviously in the technology sector, there's a legacy of places, Oracle, Qualcomm, Amazon, where people used technology as platforms, and it created incredible value for these organizations. But sitting here in Copenhagen, I can't help but think about Lego, right? And the danger of doing this here is there's obviously somebody in the room who knows the Lego story better than I do. But Lego's an incredible brand for a long time that was really struggling for some period of time. They had struggles of what was going to happen with them. And almost by accident, Lego introduced a product and hackers kind of got into it, and people at the company were very upset about, what are we doing? We should stop this. And then someone's like, no, we should enable this. And basically, Lego today is one of the biggest co-creation communities in the world for extending the R&D capabilities of their organization. Their community of people who care about their work is helping extend their work and define their product strategy. And they've totally turned inside out their R&D processes to be able to go through that, because it can't be the wild, wild west. It's not crowdsourcing, people vote and they build every feature. It's really altering their R&D process in order to really take that input and use it to better define the future of what they're looking at. And so in their context, it's because they want their users to actually define what they use. And I think this is actually a really interesting element for a lot of the work that you have, because a lot of times we want to serve people, but we don't actually give them a voice in how we're serving them, right, or what they want in that. The example I'll give outside of your domain is that I was with a friend of mine who's got an organization that's worked with basically women who've been in gender violence in conflict zones. And one of the biggest things that she said that they did is they said, we went in and we just said, we're not going to tell you how to tell your story. We want to hear your story, and we want you to tell us what you'd like to see change in the system. And they were like, there was almost shock, because a lot of these women had been interviewed by lots of people, but they're like, nobody's ever asked us how we think the system should change. And being able to create engagement gives you a very different sense of shaping your own mission as well. The Uber Airbnb examples, I think they've been quoted about 7 times this weekend, so I'll skip those. You guys may have heard of those 2 organizations. But again, using platforms to change what their interface to the world. All right, so this is great, Narinder. Thanks for the technology lesson. How do I apply or think about this for us? Well, I think about a lot of things that I've heard through the week. Like, first of all, internal metrics. Just think about the exercise you went through to fill out the survey that David had went through in Tableau earlier this weekend. And a lot of you actually have federated structures inside, and I bet the process of you collecting data from them is the same as NetHope collecting data from you. Right? So how do you think about start opening up those things, making your systems in a way that says, look, our metrics are API callable, because we need to have a situation where we're transparent with that information internally and eventually externally. Stories of success, relationships that you have, the actual work that you do. Really thinking about, is there an opportunity for us to open source our model? And this is a thing, and it'll apply to some of you and probably not at all to others, but I find resistance to opening up the shared assets that are possible in organizations a lot of time in NGOs. Because there's this notion we're competing for funding, there's grants, well, if we open it up, we're losing our secret sauce. In fact, that may be true, but that platform is the same platform that's going to allow you to actually evolve and change. And so I recognize there's risk to opening up some of the assets that you may have, whether it be mapping data, your relationships and local presence, all sorts of things that have historically made your organization successful. Sharing that asset has risk to it, but it also has the ability to create platforms for you that'll let you navigate this future, and we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. So really thinking about platforms around the solutions that you provide and how you can make those resources available to others beyond your four walls. Second, I want to talk a little bit about technology, and I'm not going to talk specifically in detail about infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service, except to let me start this for a second. This is a good one. How many folks in the room, raise your hand if more than half your infrastructure is on some infrastructure as a service solution? A couple hands. Raise your hand if more than half your applications are in the cloud deployment model. A few more. So roughly a little less than half and then half, and then I won't talk about platforms as someplace in between. This is an interesting place, is that where we've seen that there's really huge advantage to using these platforms. In your industry, there's times where you'll say, hey, it's not possible because of connectivity. And that may be true, or it may not be true, but the point being, it's a question and a boundary that should be pushed again and again and again, because at some point in the future, if you think about what Peter said this morning, it's going to be not true for your area. And you don't want to be 2 years behind that curve when it happens. The other part of this is that, when you think about platforms, especially on technology, a lot of times you get people and everybody wants to make everything a platform. The whole notion of a platform is that it's not something you can do every day. So really thinking about what are the couple things we're going to bet on. Not we're going to have 7 platforms that we think about, one for mobile and this and this and this. What is going to be a true platform for us, and let's put the resources behind it to be successful, right? I want to think about analytics and data. Maybe that's important to you. Maybe that's critical for you. Maybe connectivity is critical for you. Maybe it's, mobile. Whatever it is, being selective, because chances are you don't have the resources on the IT side to select platforms for your entire architecture. You got to pick them off one at a time in order to really get the organization behind it, in order to translate it into areas that people care about and go from there. The third part is I want to talk a little bit about talent. Guesses who this is? That's right. Peter's right. This is Bill Joy, a co-founder of Sun. At one point, considered one of the smartest guys in tech, if you think about all the things that he went through. And he had this quote, no matter who you are, most of the smartest people work for someone else. Right? I think everybody needs to be reminded, right? Because we often hire great people. We have the best of the best in our industry. It's part of the reason other people come here. But you're always going to be faced with this situation. And there's a couple things that I think about this in, especially in a world where there's so many things happening. Think back to the first part of what I talked about, how many different things are happening. You're not going to have experts in all of them. I really like this graph because it has the word suck threshold on it, and I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. And that is actually the threshold I operate at a lot of times. And you try to cross over into this place where you don't just give up, right? It's too hard. There's a learning curve. The most productive person to do a task is the person that did almost the same thing last week, right? And that's really true in technology. Think about how niche and narrow the tasks are that we do. Then you get to an amateur base, and then eventually, you get to knowing that, hey, it's a lifelong learning improvement area. So this is one dimension of talent where it's just so costly to do the first-time learning curve that you want to be able to pull people in a quick manner, and that's why we hire consultants sometime. But that's also a heavyweight comparatively. The other side is not just about the learning curve, but it's about really opening ourselves up to new ideas. So this graph has got the probability of something being great versus the value of an idea. And it's the probability distribution of ideas. And you see one line is non-traditional participants, the other is experts in that field. And what you find is the average value, the middle of the curve for an expert, is going to be better than somebody who has no expertise in that. But what you can do is if you can open up your problem to enough people, you're not competing with averages, you're competing with the tail. And so the tail of non-traditional experts, you see this all the time, vastly outperforms the average expectation of giving it to one of your experts. And let me illustrate this through an example. So this graph's a little bit hard to see, but this is basically a story. Harvard Medical School hired a grad student to say, I need you to optimize this algorithm called GWAS, Genome-Wide Association Studies, and you need to optimize the speed at which it runs because we've had a lot more genomic data, and this thing takes 15,000 seconds to run. That's a bunch of the green dots. It's called MegaBlast was the algorithm. The NIH had an open source version of it. So they took a year, they had a full-time person work on it, and they raised both the quality and the speed. The speed went from 15,000 seconds to about 360 seconds. They spent about 120K. They had a traditional expert work on it. They took that same problem, they put it in front of the top coder community and their data science experts. There was about 300 people that participated, and these are roughly the top 40 or 50 scores. And if you look at that graph, it's a log scale, and lower is better, being closer to the 0 point, and higher is better in terms of quality. So you can see it wasn't just 1 or 2 points, it was a huge segment of people that were able to outperform the traditional expert. And ultimately, it's a math problem. You have more people participating in your problems, right? And so crowdsourcing is a mechanism to help you with idea generation or being able to plug into problems that you traditionally wouldn't have the expertise to solve or just need a broader set of people to go after is a really important aspect of how do you architect the world. How do you become the conductor in your orchestra rather than having to fill every seat? So platforms by definition are supposed to have this 10, 100x potential, and same aspect and takeaway as I mentioned on the technology side. You've got to be selective in exploring these in your organization. If you went and said, let's do everything you just mentioned, we're going to go do that, it's going to fail, right? You got to put the wood behind the arrow of something you care about. So if it's we're going to put a platform to really open ourselves up and get user input or get donor input or internal input, however you're going to think about that, really putting the organizational consistency, not just making it a one-off initiative, is really important to drive that change. So, basically, if you think about this, we really have seen the math change. Like the math of what this means, this notion of run, build, transform, and how technology has to be allocated, has to change in organizations. So if I was looking at your IT budget and percentages, the organization, you can shave a point off, a quarter point off, whatever it is, but really the difference is going to be like what's inside of that. Are you working on things that matter? Are you still just spending money to keep the lights on? And it's a really difficult thing to say, look, we're going to transform that, but it's not just important for your organization, it's actually important for your workforce too. How are you going to future-proof the careers of everybody in your organization who cares about your mission but has a group of technology skills that might be last generation, right? And so it's actually a meaningful aspect of change for them and positively done correctly. So you have to go through looking at this in a different manner altogether. And so if there's one takeaway from this, to me, it's not how much you're spending on technology, it's what you're doing with it. And really thinking about, are we keeping the lights on? Are we affecting the mission that we care about? Are we affecting the reason we join this organization, the reason people donate to this, the people's lives that we impact? How do we shift to that as much as possible? So, if I think about back to the initial piece of what you guys are, these things are not going to carry you across the divide. But you do have a ton of assets. You have incredible brands. You have expertise in solving problems. You have people who care about those. You have economics that give you some ability to invest. You have data on what works and doesn't. You have local presence. These are huge aspects of things that can help, but even they are not enough. It'll be the alignment and the willingness of the organization that changes that either creates new solutions with nimble giants or lets somebody else jump into those areas for you. And so to me, that's the takeaway, is that I think the same kind of transition and extreme changes we've seen in the for-profit sector, we won't see those mimic themselves, but we will see the trajectory of that impacting your industry over the next decade. And the question will be, will you be Blockbuster, or will you be the new nimble giant who actually uses what you have and puts it and aligns it with people's lives and how they matter? So with that, I want to thank you guys for your time today. And if we have a couple minutes, maybe if there's any questions. One here. I'll repeat it until you go.
So what if your suckability factor for keeping the lights on is really high, right?
You repeat that?
Yeah. What if your suckability factor for keeping the lights on is really high? You know, it's not an easy problem to go through. I think the biggest thing is that you have to educate and enable the rest of the organization to make hard choices. Let me give you an example. So I was in one of the breakouts the other day, and they were like, you know, the person who was presenting, and they're here someplace, was like, yeah, you know what, they really pushed us. We had to have an offline solution for this. Then we started using it. We discovered less than 10% were using that solution, right? And I asked, how much more did that cost to develop? How much more and it was like, I don't know, a lot. I was like, would you have architected the same? The answer was no, right? And so maybe it was the right answer to do it that way, but the point is I think the organization has to understand that cost. By making that decision, you are forcing me to spend money on keeping the lights on in the future, right? And I think educating the organization is one step for that. And then the second part is hard trade-offs, right? To say, look, we're going to build something that's optimized for 3 years from now, and we are shortchanging this part of our organization as a result, right? I think people are too unwilling to make those choices and sometimes not educated enough. So there's no magic answer to this, but you've got to force those kinds of trade-offs in a much more aggressive way. Otherwise, you will be in the hamster wheel.
There's a question over there.
Yeah.
You know, really early on, one of your slides said, measure what you care about. And I'm reminded of a study that came out of actually Aperia while you were still active with them, where you went and talked to people who'd done a successful cloud adoption 6 months later. And the dominant comment that they made is, we spent way too much time on cost justification. We had no concept of what the acceleration of the business was going to be, the agility improvements. They measured what they cared about, which was either IT spend, because that was a number they could see and measure. And I'm wondering, in your experience, when you give people a chance to start measuring stuff, they tend to start looking for their keys under the street light instead of down the street in the puddle where they actually dropped them? Do they measure the things that are easily measurable, easily quantifiable, show up in a P&L, instead of going to a higher level and saying, what should we be caring about, that may be very soft and difficult to measure, but those are the measures that would actually drive us in good directions?
Only Peter would use my own study against me, right? He's like, what about this one? No, it's a great point. And I think there's two parts to Peter's question, almost a point. First is this notion of people measure what they know how to measure. And you guys are used to that, right? Because it's hard to measure lives impacted. How much and how are you going to measure that? That's a long-term question, right? And so sometimes you skip to something easier. And sometimes that proxy measurement actually makes sense. In this context, though, I think the biggest thing is this, is that if you have people from the technology side who understand, who can step into the role, their measurements for why will be very different, right? Because they actually have a sense of, I see and feel the pain of my coworker who is processing expenses, managing donations, trying to report metrics to grantors. They'll understand that in a way that'll be a lot more nuanced. And so the big part is that sometimes you have to go through that because you haven't had a bridge between the organizational areas. But as the organization gets smarter, you'll be able to actually make better estimates on what you're going to change, because the technology folks will understand what's at stake and what's happening, and the business folks will be more technology savvy to say, you know what, I know I shouldn't have to copy and paste and re-enter this data again and again. So the big piece of allowing people to go through that is actually that bridging. Though, in fact, I think what we've seen is a lot of times cloud implementations are the first time you've seen that effective bridging happening. And I think that's less true than it was, but it's still, unfortunately, the case very often.
We have time for one more question. Eric.
Up here?
Yeah, you talked about customer and being able to understand them closely for success. What about paying customers, and particularly old philanthropy? How do we bring old philanthropy along? Do we just wait for new philanthropy and we'll be good?
You know, you got to end with that question. It's the hard. You can, you know.
No. We have one more
All right,
later
good.
on.
You're gonna somebody can ask a softball, please, after that. So here's the point. Like, I don't know. I think that there's one part that's a easier. So, well, wait, yes, new philanthropy, Kickstarter to fund your stuff. All that stuff may come, but you know when, right? And I do think there's an education of philanthropists, and I say this sometimes to people in new markets. Like, if I was developing a new solution in any company, I would look for the smartest customers first, because those are the ones who are going to spread, right? And you know what? Dollars aren't made the same. Like, if you're trying to be progressive, you got to go look for progressive funders, right? And every dollar is not made the same. The second part, though, is that if you don't, you will get killed by new philanthropy over time. So, in fact, there's not really a choice, but I don't know if there's a clear and easy answer to what you go through and do that with. And I think, you know, there's an argument to be made is that we should actually put, you know, funders through these kinds of things more. And having been on both sides of it, I think you'll find all sorts of heterogeneity across funders. And the only thing I can think is find the ones that are progressive enough to buy into what you have and give them the information that lets them justify it to their own constituencies as well.
Okay, Sophie, it's time for the softball.
Softball.
So I'm a program person. You're preaching to a choir here, because I think everybody in the room and those who have already left are 10,000% convinced that technology and increasing our usage of technology and actually retooling and re-engineering our organizations are the way to the future. However, the people who are not in the room, because they're more risk averse towards technology, don't necessarily understand it. If I go to them and I say, if we don't change the way we work, we're going to become blockbuster, that's shock and awe, and I'm not sure it's going to spring them into action. And one of my understanding is that it's critical to get leadership on board of that massive transformation, because it's not just switching from PBX to Skype for business, right? It's really totally rethinking who we are and how we work. What is what is your Twitter for embarking leadership into this massive technological change? Thank you.
So you asked me to solve that in a tweet? Is that what I got from that? So I have a couple thoughts. The first one is, let's be realistic. You guys are not going to have the extreme pressure of Blockbuster because there's not M&A. There's not as much M&A in your sector, right? Collaboration barriers are there. There's large institutional funding. So it will be a slower. It'll be a boil the frog versus a direct kind of thing. And that's both good and bad, right? It's good in that your organizations have more time. It's bad in that it's actually really difficult to recover from being the boiling frog, right? So I think you have to recognize that realism before you walk in and say, oh my God, we're going to get Ubered, right? I would never say that to somebody on a leadership team of a nonprofit. That said, I think the point is of finding places where people can really feel that. You have an opportunity for that you've never had before, because for the first time in our lives, consumer technology is better than business technology. Like, that's only been true for the last 15 years or so. So you're seeing even leaders and organizations say, why do I have to go to 7 different places in our organization to figure out how many people we helped last year when I can find my entire stock portfolio and medical history on my phone, right? So I think using those consumer level references to actually drive the understanding of how different it could be, you do have that as a usage point, right? And then you start building from there and saying, all right, why can't we be like that in area X? And you got to prove it at least once. Nobody's going to buy in without seeing results in some area. Right, and so that's the second part. And the third part is this. A lot of the things I talked about in terms of measuring and changing your teams doesn't need leadership approval, right? It needs your leadership on driving a different behavior in your teams. And that part also can begin in parallel. So, not a tweetable answer, and certainly not an airtight one. It comes down to willpower, right? How aggressively will you move from this build, run, transform bucketing to something else? And I think that's the other thing is, like, nobody wants to say we're spending money on keeping the lights on versus helping the lives of children in Africa, right? And so that's the contrast of the portfolio IT budget. And I think getting executive buy-in to say, don't you want us to help more kids, right, or whatever it is, I think it really is getting it into that framework and using that to somehow align with your budgeting process around technology to try to force it from both sides. All right, thanks, everybody.